Welcome to Wine with John. I am John, and today we are going to talk a little bit about this podcast and what we hope to get out of it. If you know me from online, you probably know me from my short videos, long-form videos, teaching beginners about wine, and maybe you know me about my collection and what I teach about collecting. But this podcast is about something a little bit different. This podcast is really meant for people who work in wine. So we're talking about sommeliers, we're talking about winemakers and retailers and auction houses, wine bar owners and importers and distributors, and even content creators. So anybody whose livelihood is connected to the industry. And so what we're talking about is the future. What is the future of wine? So how do we as an industry make wine interesting, compelling to young people who are already drinking less than maybe they were in previous generations? So that's the question. Listen, I don't have all the answers, and I know that there's a lot of smart people thinking about this stuff. So let's bring those conversations together. But before we get to those conversations, I thought that maybe I should tell you a little bit more about myself. So this first episode is just me. It's my story about how I got into wine, what led me to start a wine bar, and this content, and here's this podcast. So let's get at it. So all this starts a long time ago. I'm a food person. I've just always been a food person. I'm not like somebody who likes to eat, like I am into food to get fat. I am like somebody who likes different flavors, who always has been interested in that, even before it wasn't particularly trendy. So I'm going to give you an example. So back in 1994, I'm graduating from college in Washington, D.C., and I actually make the plans for my graduation dinner. And the plans were made at Jean-Louis at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. So if you are a culinary history buff, you're going to know about this. But Jean-Louis Paladin was a legendary French chef, and he was actually the youngest chef in France to earn 2 Michelin stars before he came to the United States. He won James Beard Award the year before I had that dinner, so 1993, and he trained a bunch of chefs. He was friends with Daniel Boulud, and he was basically the inventor of farm to table in the United States before we had a name for it. And so I am, in my young 20s, and I drag my father, who was a lawyer, a very practical person, to a restaurant where back then dinner was like $100 or $200 a person, back in 1994 dollars. And my father's jaw just dropped. It was the cost, it's the formality, the whole experience, and it just was not for him. But I remember sitting there thinking, this is it. This is like food as art, and this is what I am interested in. So this idea that these two things, food and drink, could be mixed together is more than just fuel, was something that was really memorable to me. And I knew this even before wine really entered the picture. Wine entered later, and that also came through family. So I met the woman who would become my wife and later my ex-wife, but I met her, and her father was a dermatologist, a really successful one. But his real passion was wine. And I mean passion. Like he literally bought land in rural Maryland and planted a vineyard. He made his own wine. He had a wine cellar, and he took wine trips, and he had wine friends, and he had wine clubs, and I didn't really have exposure to that, but I'll tell you what I did have exposure to: cutting the vines. So the family would need to help cut the vines, and that was a wonderful experience. You had workers, and they would cut the vines, and you'd have a nice sandwich, and it was wonderful. But then one year, the family really had to cut the vines. There was a worker shortage at the very same time. There was terrible weather. I mean, freezing, bone-chilling coldness. And basically what happened was that we were responsible for taking care of cutting that year. And I was miserable. Now, the irony of this whole thing is that my father-in-law needed to end up selling the vineyard in order to pay for the weddings, my wedding and, the sister's wedding. So there's 2 weddings in 1 year. And he decided to get out of it, which, quite frankly, for me was just fine. But my father-in-law, he would pull bottles from the cellar, and he loved it. I mean, he would pull out the wine, and he'd present it, and it was a terrible presentation. I mean, he was just having a really hard time kind of communicating anything that would be interesting to me as kind of a food nerd anyway. And I was just thinking, I wish I understood this a little bit better. Now, this is by the way, this is no knock on this man. He is a wonderful, warm person. He is one of the best dermatologists who practiced in a major city, wonderful father and father-in-law, great-grandfather. But I kept thinking, what if I could bridge that gap? Couldn't somebody explain wine a little bit better and make it more interesting and accessible to other people? And now that kind of was my career because I was an attorney. And so attorneys basically take these really complicated concepts and explain it to normal business people, or they explain it to, for example, a jury. And that's kind of what we do, right? So we are there and we are translating. We are distilling information. So fast forward in time, I decide I'm going to become interested in this. I'm a practicing lawyer, but I start WSET class. So I am taking formal wine classes. Now, everybody in my class were like servers. People were trying to achieve basic certification to become sommeliers or something like that. And I was just doing this for myself. There was no professional requirement. I was 100% curious. But what WSET gave me was something really important, which was structure. So I've always been good at kind of separating out flavors and finding different smells, and that was real natural. But WSET, and by the way, I went on and took a lot more different certifications from other organizations. They all have kind of a framework. So a rhythm and an ethos and kind of a standardization. The vocabulary, the ability to put words to what I was smelling and what I was tasting, what I was sensing. And all this got me a little bit more interested in collecting, which we'll get to in a minute. But here's what happened with me. I really started to notice this gap, that there was a difference between how wine people talk about in wine class and then the formal language, the tasting notes and the graphite and the cassis and the hints of tobacco. And then there was this way people talked about it in real life, at dinner parties or on dates. And they talked about it in the same way music. Oh, I remember this. I like this because it reminds me of. That disconnect, it just keeps people out. And so if you've ever felt intimidated by a wine list, or you've just had a sommelier describe something and you're like, I have no idea. And you would just point at the second cheapest bottle because, of course, that's what you do. That's the gap I'm talking about. So I became a little bit obsessed with this. So now, meanwhile, I am starting to buy wine, seriously buy wine. So in the early days, I ordered mostly from a company called Wine Access, and they were an online wine merchant. But what really set them apart, at least to me, was the way they communicated and the way they told the story. Now, they would tell you about the winemaker and the region and the taste and all this stuff. And they would tell you why that particular bottle mattered. And all that combined kind of made things interesting. But what they also did a great job with, and I'm sure they still do, is tasting notes. They would put tasting notes with a hanger in with the wines. And so you could drink them at a future date and then know what you were doing. Now, eventually I started collecting and actually keeping notes and doing reviews and doing all these nerdy things that you learn about in my videos. But at the time, it was like a gateway. And they were giving me context, which is really something I wasn't used to, right? Because of how my father-in-law would present wine. So, of course, I start collecting wine. And like many people, I have more wine than space. I have more wine than refrigerators. And I eventually get a self-storage unit. And so I have a self-storage unit, which is wine controlled, that I put my extra boxes in. I have too much wine at home in my various refrigerators, and then COVID hit. and I decided to make a little bit of a bet. So I had this theory that when the pandemic ended and people could get together and they could celebrate and stuff like that, they were going to start popping champagne, like figuratively and literally pop champagne. And so I started stocking up. So I found a company that would store it for me properly. And so between the self-storage unit, the wine fridges at home, professional champagne storage, I kind of started to build something. And I went from kind of the guy who had some wine to becoming a collector. And so that's, you're thinking about the market, you're thinking about allocation, you're thinking about long-term storage, you're thinking about relationships, you're thinking about values, you're thinking about what you're going to drink. That became me. Not unlike a lot of people who are lawyers or doctors. So I'm going to take you on a little walk through a business idea I had. So way back when, I had this idea of a bookstore. And the idea was to take this neighborhood bookstore and to expand it into a community hub. And so this was a little bit before Barnes & Noble and Borders and those types of places were getting big, if you could remember them. And the idea was that you'd have a little bit of everything that would connect people besides books, places to gather, the coffee shop, the vibes, the music, the events. And the venue that was really built around community to be a place of connection. Now, the book industry changed a lot, but the business plan was kind of a little bit ahead of its time and way too late, maybe at the same time. But the core vision just never left. I just needed this different vehicle. And wine kind of started to make sense to me. So here's why. Books and wine are actually about the same fundamental problems. So there's just so many options, it's like paralyzing. This is not like Coke or Pepsi or what soft drink or whether you're going to have beef or chicken. It is thousands and thousands and honestly more selections of wine. And both categories, books and wine, people need help choosing. And so that's why book clubs exist. That's why wine clubs exist. So it's a curation, it's guidance. There's somebody who's saying, look, I've tried it. You'll like it because you liked this other book or this other wine. I also learned as a lawyer that wine is kind of a connector. So like when clients found out that I knew about wine, I started getting invited to a lot of things. People just wanted me to pick the wine for dinner. So it built relationships, it opened doors, the interest was there. It was good for business. I just needed a little bit more. So, since we're talking about my past businesses, I also owned ice cream stores. And so there is one thing that is absolutely amazing about ice cream is that we picture it full. Just a lot of people there with their kids, having a nice day, having something to eat together, packed, waiting in lines. Here's the reality. That isn't how it works at all. In fact, the way that it works is that you have a bunch of people there for about 5 or 6 hours the whole week. Most of the time it's empty. And that really just stuck with me, kind of as a business thing. It's just a waste. So when I started developing the concept for Preface Wine, I was really obsessed with something called day parts. That means how do you use the same space effectively throughout the whole day? And so the answer is that you transform it. So Preface is a wine store by day and a wine bar at night. About 4 p.m. we transition. The lighting changes, furniture moves, the energy shifts, music's different, everything. It's genuinely like a different place. It's that same rent check every month, but it's like double the utility. So this isn't just like an operational thing. It's just a better experience. So during the day, you're browsing, you're buying bottles to take home. You could stop at the wine bar that's open all day, have a quick glass, talk to a sommelier. But at night, you're kind of with family, you're with friends, you're settling in, we have tastings, you're connecting with other people. And so these are two totally different relationships with wine in one space, in one community. So let's talk about Preface. Why that name? Now, it won't surprise you to hear it comes from books, because this came from books, right? To books, to wine. And a preface is the beginning of the story. It's the introduction. It sets up what the story is to come. So we're using this concept in a relatively small space in Delray Beach, Florida, as kind of a test lab. And we're testing theories about whether young professionals will engage with wine at all. Whether it's wine club, whether it's other things that people connect with that we can scale. We are also experimenting with technology. So we're trying to enhance the human connection without replacing the true glue, which is other people. So for Preface, for our customers, it's meant to be a preface on their wine exploration. So here's what I believe. Here's my theory. My theory is that wine is terribly intimidating to most people, and it just doesn't have to be. It really doesn't. They go to a grocery store, they grab something, they go, and there's nothing special about that. Now, it might signify that it's the end of the day or the beginning of the weekend, but there's like a real hunger out there about learning about wine, mostly because people don't want to look silly, foolish, dumb. They don't want to feel like everybody knows and they don't. And so here's the truth. Wine is not that complicated. It really isn't. It's just something you could choose to learn about. And unlike a lot of the things that you could choose to learn about, this is very social. Like, you learn it with other people. You taste with other people. You have connection. Now, of course, you could taste wine at home. I'm drinking a champagne right now. You can taste wine at home, but for the most part, you are doing it with others. So when people are tasting wine at Preface, my theory is, what do they need? They just need an interesting fact. That's it. They don't need a lecture or a dissertation about the wine. They just need enough to make that sip a little bit more interesting than just a random wine that they had. So you don't have to give the whole philosophy. Just like lower the bar, lower the barrier, give people permission, meet them where they are. Okay, so there's another reason to bet heavily on this wine club model. If you think about how often restaurants and bars are opening and closing, in fact, it happens all the time. When you hear about it, you have this reaction, which is like, oh, I loved that place. And then if you ask the follow-up question, when's the last time you went to that place you love so much? It's something like 8 months ago, something like 8 months ago, maybe a year. I don't know. But people love a place in theory, but they don't show up in practice because life gets busy. There's other places. Intentions are different, but they don't become actions. So the wine club kind of solves that. It's a glue. So when you're a member, you have a reason to come back. There's tasting this week. There's your new allocation. There are people you know who will be there. There's a commitment. There's community. There's consistency. And it really does keep a place alive, right? It's not just like great wine is there. It gives people a reason to return. So there's one more piece to this puzzle, and that is technology. So here's what happens to me all the time. People think of me as their wine friend, the sommelier. John's the sommelier. I don't know. I'm at a restaurant. They don't know what to order. They're at a restaurant. They don't know what to order. And they send me a picture of the wine list. Or they're at the wine store and they show me a wall and it's a photo. And they say, pick it for me. And I like it. It's fun. I ask questions. And by the way, this means I'm answering a lot of text messages like at random hours too. But I thought, what if we could scale that? So what if AI could be that wine friend that everybody wants to have access to? And so that's something that we're actively working on. So we're not trying to replace that human connection, that the sommelier, the retailer, the person across the bar who is trying to expand your taste. We're just extending that concept. We're trying to make that available at any time, at any point, be able to do that as easily as through a text message. And I think that tech is going to make a massive difference into how we welcome people into this new world. So that brings me to this podcast, why we are here. So my Wine with John content is, to me at least, I think valuable. So it's giving people small bites and large bites of kind of information is education. But it doesn't really answer the question that the industry is generally grappling with, which, what is the future of wine? And so how are we going to make wine more interesting and compelling to young people who are already drinking less than other generations? So these are professionals, and there are a number of reasons why wine should matter to them. As a young professional, there's social reasons, there's personal reasons. Wine is a great connector. It's a great hobby. It's a great way to learn about history and geography and agriculture and chemistry all at once. But how do we communicate that? Like, how are we welcoming them in? And that's not a question that any one person can answer. So it takes perspectives from many people in the industry. And so retailers might see it one way, an auction house might see it a different way, winemakers, sommeliers, content creators, everybody has their own point of view and their little piece of the puzzle. So I figured, what a great excuse to reach out to everybody and have one place where we could have a one-on-one sit down once a week, and we could talk about the future of this thing that we all love. And that's what this podcast is. It's just a conversation. So I'm really glad that you're here for it. So in the coming weeks, we are going to start talking to people from every corner of the wine world. We're going to talk to sommeliers who are rethinking how guests are served. We're going to talk to retailers who are experimenting with new ways to reach customers. We're going to talk to winemakers who are building brands that really connect with younger people. And we're going to talk to content creators who are really changing the way in which all this works. And so if you work in wine and you're thinking about these questions, please join us, and we'll learn a little bit more about how we're all adapting, how we're all evolving, and how to bring new people in, how to bring in young people. This podcast is for all the people who are trying to reach out to this new generation. So subscribe wherever you're listening now. You can follow Wine with John on social media. YouTube has a lot of content there. There are some short forms on Instagram, TikTok, and everywhere else. But this is intended to be a conversation. So this is not a monologue. So thanks for being here. I'm John. This is Wine with John. And let's figure out the future together.